Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of Horizons. We are going to be talking today about expanding fair chance hiring. And I'm here with three experts that are really going to help us examine and explore some questions, but more importantly, to talk about some solutions for making this, instead of an exception, the expected way of doing business. So with me today, we have Ken Oliver, who's the Director of Business Development from Crop. We have Lauren Bell, who's the Fair Chance Program Manager for Checkr. And we have Jeffrey Korzenik, who's the Chief Investment Strategist. And importantly for us today, he's also the author of a book entitled Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community. So welcome everybody to this session today. I'm so glad that you could join us and really looking forward to the conversation that we can have. I'm going to really try to frame our conversation with three big ideas in mind for the audience to follow us with. The first, what does fair chance hiring look like? Why does fair chance hiring matter? And then importantly, how can businesses do it well? So with that, let's kick off with this first question of really, what does fair chance hiring look like? And Jeffrey, I'm going to go to you first. How do you define fair chance hiring in your book? And if you want to go into it, tell a little bit about why the definition you've chosen is important.
Sure. I use interchangeably second chance or fair chance hiring. In the book, I'm focusing, and in most of my work, I focus specifically on giving employment opportunities to people with criminal records. And I use fair chance because I think it's only fair. If someone has, made a mistake, but done their time, it's only fair that they be given an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves, rebuild their lives. Second chance is similar. People who've made a mistake can earn the right to a second chance. And for many people, of course, this is really a first chance. By either definition, it encompasses, a range of practices and critically business processes that work not just for people with criminal records, but can help include many, many other types of marginalized workers and lead them to lives of productivity, contribution, and economic mobility.
And I think that's such an important point, Jeffrey, that you just raised, that fair chance hiring practices are important to really engage people with records, but they also lead to good business practice in general that really enhances the whole business. And so, Ken, I'm going to go to you because you have experience on both ends of this, creating fair chance hiring processes and practices with employers, but also being someone who needed that fair chance hire. I'm curious if you would share with us, what does that feel like? What does it feel like to get that chance? And then how does it change an employer's place of business when they give those opportunities?
Sure, I appreciate that. I think Jeffrey did a very good job laying out what second chance is. For myself and for people that are formerly incarcerated or have been justice involved, I think it boils down to some very simple principles. The first being opportunity, the second being equity, and the opportunity for economic mobility, and really the chance to thrive. I think we all have a sense of not wanting to be defined or judged by some type of scarlet letter that highlights the biggest mistake or mistake, period, that we've made in our lives. So to be able to give people the opportunity to get into the workforce, to be able to provide for their family and to be able to thrive just like everybody else, I think is paramount.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to take this question to Lauren. So people may have heard of Checkr. It's a background check company. And typically that's seen as being an obstacle for people who are seeking to be hired, that dreaded box, or just knowing that the background check is going to come out and it's going to expose and open up all these questions and typically lead to you not being hired. But Lauren, talk a little bit about how Checkr is positioning themselves and background checking as actually an opportunity to expand fair chance hiring.
Thank you so much, Lucretia, and good afternoon to everybody. It is a really important question and one that Checkr takes very seriously. Our CEO, Daniel, learned very early on about the impact of background checks on people with criminal records. In our earlier years, he was actually answering phone calls from people who were being denied employment because of their background checks. In some cases, it was a person who grew up in a neighborhood that was impacted by crime and violence. In another situation, it was somebody who admitted they had made a mistake when they were younger, but they were looking to make a life change through employment. There were people who made bad decisions, who went on to go to college, who developed incredible professional networks, and really just wanted to get ahead in life, only to be sidelined by their criminal record. So Daniel and the team committed to building the most efficient technology that we could in the background check industry, but also wanting to make sure that our work didn't prevent ambitious, career-minded people from professional success. So we anchored our Fair Chance mission at that point in time. Our mission is to build a fairer future by improving our understanding of the past. So in other words, we want to make sure that every person has a fair chance at employment. And I just briefly want to talk about how our mission shows up in a lot of aspects of our business. First and foremost, in the space where we can scale the most change, it shows up in our products. We've got an incredible team of engineers and designers who think critically every day about how we can integrate fairness into our technology. Shameless plug, some of you might have heard that Checkr recently won the Fair Company's World Changing Ideas Award in the AI and data category for our Assess service. And Assess is actually a service for customers that can widen the talent funnel and is also an opportunity for career-minded people with past records to be considered for employment. We believe so strongly in the benefits of our fairness products that Checkr actually is a company that sets an annual goal to unblock people from employment. So this means that our tools actually help to open career doors, employment consideration for people who wouldn't previously have been considered for employment because of their background. In 2020, we set an annual metric to unblock 1 million people. And with the help of our customers, we unblocked 1.5 million people. In 2021, we've doubled down to set that metric to 3 million people. Secondly, our mission shows up in our hiring. Checkr is an unapologetic fair chance employer. We embrace and consistently use best practices in hiring, everything from removing education and years of experience on our job descriptions, all the way to ensuring skills-based assessment in the recruitment process. As a company, every company is going to look at what is your bottom line risk that you want to make sure you're giving proper attention to. For Checkr, our red flags come up for people who have convictions related to personal identity theft. But outside of that, Checkr will consider candidates with every variety of conviction history. And we use a really diligent review process to make sure we're getting the greatest talent. Part of our motto is we're not trying to reduce the performance bar, we're trying to reduce the barrier into jobs. And lastly, one of the reasons why we're here today and why we do a lot of these kind of conversations is because we want to advocate fair chance practices. There's a lot of false narratives. Ken and Jeff talk about this. A lot of false narratives in the business community. Jeff, I know these are areas that you talk about a lot. Businesses talk about liabilities, they talk about performance, and they talk about reputation. And for businesses that really are willing to step into this space, to learn from leaders like Ken, to learn from leaders like Jeff, you can refute all of those fears. Some of these fears are really kind of media driven at the end of the day. And what we see from data, what Checkr sees personally from our colleagues who are formerly incarcerated, is that a lot of those narratives really are not telling the whole story. So just to come full circle, we recognize that background checks have a huge impact on folks, and we commit ourselves every day to working internally and externally to being a business that opens doors to people and to really wanting to create ripple effects in the tech and business community so that other businesses will come on board and open their doors to more people with records.
Lauren, what you've raised, I think, ties so nicely into a comment that Jeffrey has in his book. He says, criminal justice is good for business and business is good for criminal justice. It kind of cuts at the heart of perceptions and myths about the hordes of criminals coming in to disrupt your business, your lack of customers, how it's going to impact people. I'm wondering, Jeffrey, if you want to talk a little bit about what that statement means in practice. And I know your book goes into some really, really targeted arguments to both refute the myths, but also to prove the affirmative. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you see that working in practice, and then we can have a conversation around it. But it's such a great statement.
Sure. Well, the starting point is that it is in the business community's interests to have better outcomes in our criminal justice system. The trajectory and the pace of economic growth for any economy is largely a function of how fast can you grow your workforce and how productive can your workforce be. There are 19 million Americans with a felony conviction who are either out of the labor force, unemployed but searching, or underemployed. Many are underemployed below their ability because they don't have economic mobility. And that's a waste of talent and a pool of potential talent that is so large the business community can't ignore it, particularly at a time when our workforce growth is challenged by demographic factors. So criminal justice reform, part of criminal justice reform has to be giving people who are justice involved better possibilities for employment and economic mobility. At the same time, the criminal justice community and reformers benefit from the acumen of the business community. Employment is perhaps not the only factor in true rehabilitation, but it is foundational. It's very hard to rehabilitate and get back into society and frankly not be inclined to reoffend or get rearrested if you don't have the ability to get a good job and a job with advancement opportunities. So the business community are historically very good problem solvers. They understand the perspective, of course, of employers, and their input is desperately needed in some of the ways that we involve people in the justice system from the get-go. Are we getting in the way of employment by, say, having cash bail requirements? Are we giving people training opportunities within the system? And then are we making things like community supervision, probation, and parole overly burdensome so it actually gets in the way of people's ability to have a job and contribute to a company? So the business community benefits from criminal justice reform, but criminal justice reform also benefits from the input of the business community.
Need to unmute. And as you think about that, Ken, I know you work a lot with employers, as well as obviously the training programs that CROP provides. As you think about that, what are the sticky points for the employers that you work with when they're obviously interested, but what are the sticky points that keep them maybe from fully committing or feeling like they can't fully commit? And what kind of solution points do you help them reach so that they can really open up that fair chance hiring?
Unmute. It's amazing. We all do these Zoom calls every day, and unmute still happens. It's a great point, and it's a point that Lauren made earlier about these false narratives typically that we all have as community members in society. And I think that the knowledge or the lack of knowledge of knowing how to put together a process that includes fair chance hiring or second chance hiring. And so, what we do out here in the Bay Area is we really encourage businesses, and we really do this with workforce development departments all over the country, is encourage businesses to get with community partners and community-based organizations who know how to process second chance talent, who work with people in the community who have criminal records, who understand hiring practices, who understand who the stakeholders are. So we really work diligently in these 8-week boot camps, which I've talked to you about before, Lucretia, which is kind of like a DEI practice. We don't ask employers to go too far outside of the box, but what we ask them to do is really have as part of their inclusion strategy and equity strategy a place for second chance hiring, and then we show them how to do that through how to project plan for something like that, how to put together equity plans of action, how to build community partnerships, et cetera, and so forth. So it's really a process. We don't usually suggest that people dive in on their own unless they have a full understanding of time, nature, time tests, and how to match a particular criminal record to a particular job skill, et cetera. But yeah, we've had tremendous success working with companies and getting people over the fear to understand that there's a human being. And most of the time, you'll find that when we create these programs for organizations, there's a great deal of human transformation that occurs both on the employer side and then both on the candidate or the talent side, where the talent, for the first time in their life, feels validated in a place like Checkr, right? I've talked to several employees at Checkr who have criminal records, and the way that they light up, the transformation that occurs when they're able to walk through the doors of a tech company and be included in that environment, right, where their work and their thought capital is valued, is life-changing for people. At the same time, most CEOs and HR people who interview or talk to a person who has a criminal record, they're usually shocked at the human being behind the piece of paper or the mark. I've done several workshops across the country, and people are floored or very surprised when I tell them that I did 24 years in prison. When I tell them that I did 9 years in solitary confinement, they can't believe it. And what that does oftentimes is it opens up the door, softens the heart, changes the mind, and then people start to see opportunity.
And I think it really does do that, right? It's the push and pull of, I know what a criminal looks like, and it's not someone who can come to my workplace and really demonstrate some sort of capacity. And I think that's the flip that happens so quickly for employers, and really to the extent we can amplify that makes such a difference, because that immediate flip, I think, is transformational for the employer and the workplace, but also for the individual. And I wonder, Lauren, if you want to talk a little bit about that. Like Ken said, referencing the people who work at Checkr, but Checkr is doing both this external work to help employers understand how they can use background checks differently. But you all are also in your own workplace hiring and using practices that are more inclusive and equity focused. I'm curious if you want to talk about that interplay. How does your internal work help you explain and define this practice to your customers and your clients?
Definitely. And I think these comments really dovetail nicely with Ken and Jeffrey's comments. And I think the importance of continuing to underscore what we know are fears in the business community, and really using an opportunity like this to uproot them is critical. So definitely want to, kind of continue to dig deeper into that. I mean, Checkr is involved in fair chance hiring because we recognize our responsibility. It's not just to job seekers and to customers who obviously are driving our business, but it is also a responsibility to the stability of families and communities. And it is through the simple, or I shouldn't say simple, but routine act of hiring. We honor that there is an incredible amount of talent out there who have criminal records. And I think to spotlight a comment, people do think they know what somebody who has been through the criminal justice system might look like, might be like. And I don't know what the stat is, but let's say 9 out of 10 times, that person is probably not correct, because a lot of what we think is driven by experiences that are not our own, not the footsteps that we have personally walked in. And I think it's human. Everybody wants to create a narrative. And part of this work that we're doing together is to really challenge ourselves to say, well, I have this narrative in my mind, but is it correct? Because a lot of times it is not. Jeffrey just touched on this, and this is an important one. One of the reasons why this is so important is that the scale of fair chance opportunity is massive. Jeffrey mentioned 19 million people with felony records. There's a bigger number that gets tossed around, and it's a little bit loaded because of all of the different things that are included inside of it. But 1 in 3 people, or nearly 77 million people in the United States, has a criminal record, some with serious offenses and some with arrests that maybe never led to conviction, for example. But to be honest, depending on where you live in the country, even an arrest record that never led to a conviction can present a barrier to a person for maybe not even just getting a job, but for being professionally mobile. There's nearly 750,000 people returning back to their communities from jails and prisons every year. And again, I think Media and some of our even smaller social circles will want to sometimes make people think, well, somebody deserved what they got, or somebody needs to continue to serve some kind of penance of some sorts. When the reality is that there are so many stories behind the reasons why somebody goes into the criminal justice system. And there are so many people with talents that need to be acknowledged. There are scores of ambitious and career-minded people, both in custody and release, who just want to work hard, prosper, and raise a family, but they are marginalized. Which leads me to, kind of a second reason why we're so committed to fair chance work. We live in an amazing country, but the United States is a country that for the most part chooses punishment over redemption and grace. Once somebody gets involved in the criminal justice system, for whatever reason that might be, we have, as a country, condemned people for far too long into a lifetime paper prison. And Jeff mentioned this when he talked about some of the complications and some of the problems with the probation and parole system. So now more than ever in the United States, we have this great opportunity. There's this momentum that's happening. There's this opportunity to really challenge these stereotypes and mitigate stigma. And really, it starts with being curious. We have this opportunity to be curious, more curious. And honestly, we should be very intellectually curious about learning more about racial disparities in sentencing, the lack of rehabilitation in corrections, the power in many demonstrations of redemption and personal transformation of people who come home. And we need to get curious about how to hire these folks. News they want to make us indifferent at best to people who are coming home, and at worst they want us to fear people who are coming home. And I think for most of us who, even if we haven't worked on the front lines of criminal justice and reentry, when we surround ourselves, as Ken said, when we get proximate to people who have been on the front lines of some challenges, who are also on the front lines of solutions, we can really start to see we can absolutely balance safety with fairness. And that's the step, that's the space that we all need to move into as businesses, as communities, as criminal justice system. The space of we can balance safety and fairness, and we can open doors to people with records, not just to entry-level jobs, but to professional jobs, to licenses that people are being denied across states, across the country. We can do this, and we have to keep pushing this momentum together.
And that is such a good jump off point, because I think so many of the challenges of criminalization is because it hides inside of it so many of our biases, racial biases, gender biases, criminalization, stigma, our perceptions of punishment over rehabilitation. It's a lot for employers to dig out of, because you have to come face to face with each layer of it. I'm wondering, Jeffrey, as you think about this question will go out to everybody. What are some of your priority practices for employers to think about when they want to start shifting to a fair chance hiring practice that also implicates larger equity and inclusion issues in their workplace?
Sure. I think a starting point is to go back to something that Lauren alluded to, the size of this talent pool. And it's very important to understand that this is not about hiring an employee of last resort or an adequate employee. When you combine the proper processes, and Ken alluded to these processes, finding who is ready to contribute to your company and giving them the support mechanisms to thrive, you get actually a superior employee, someone who's deeply engaged in their work and who's very loyal. And that's a recipe for productivity and profitability. And so it's all about establishing those models. Many, many employers have tried hiring people with records and have not had success because they did not have the process in place. So it's really all about the process. And it starts with, are you turning people away unnecessarily? Best practices would be, if you're not in a ban the box state, don't ban it. In fact, invite people of all diverse backgrounds, including people with criminal records, to apply for jobs. That's a big step for some companies. I understand not everyone's ready for that. But if you are identifying someone with a criminal record, there's typically a secondary review process. Make sure that review is not biased against the prospective employee. Some of the best practices that I've observed include putting someone from a line of business that's short people, put them on that review committee so someone is actually advocating for hiring, looking for reasons to hire, not reasons to discard the resume. And then it's very important that you have an appropriate support process. Companies are used to making accommodations for workers, right? Once upon a time, it was the ping pong table and foosball table. Now it's much more about work from home, flexibility, those kind of tools. Maybe it's daycare support. This population also has gaps and needs that require some accommodation. They're different. What employers will find is often that these needed accommodations and support mechanisms have nothing to do with a criminal record, but deep intergenerational poverty and lack of work experience. So you might want to make sure you have mentoring practices. One thing that is different for employers looking to make accommodations to support people who've been marginalized, they'll find, unlike traditional supports to attract talent, these support mechanisms have many, many willing partners like TENS organizations and organizations around the country that will be there to support them. The end goal here is to have a model that identifies who's ready and gives them the tools to thrive. It would really work with any population. This would work with Stanford Business School graduates, but they've been picked over. This is a group that is truly untapped. There's a huge pool of talent. People with criminal records, when given the supports needed and using appropriate processes selection, are good employees, good citizens, and I found personally also very good friends. There's a lot of talent here. We shouldn't overlook it.
Ken, I'm going to give you the last word as we come to the close of our session. But you've talked so eloquently. You do this around the country. You work with people who are coming out of prison and are going through programs, not just to be employees, but to be leaders. I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what's your vision of this intersection of criminal justice and work for where you'd like us to be in the future.
Sure, I appreciate that, Lucretia. First I'd like to say to the employers is that I don't think that anybody across the country who's interested in second chance is simply asking for a charity or for just an act of kindness. One of the things that we focus on as an organization, and we encourage other organizations to focus on the same, is really developing, as you mentioned, leadership and developing the talent base. We want every person that comes out of a program like ours, and there are many, to create and have a value proposition for the employer. We don't want the onus to be simply on the people that are in your audience today. We want the onus to be on the individual and create some sense of personal responsibility and leadership and the talent that they develop for themselves. We think that if that happens, we can convince employers to hire the best candidate for the job. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're asking employers to do. And what we're asking employers to do is to hire the best candidate for the job, despite a mistake that may have happened 20 years ago when a person was 22 years old. And we think that if we can take that away and create the value proposition, we'll have a much more equitable and inclusive workplace for people. We'll reduce mass incarceration and recidivism. And if we can do that, it's really a public safety issue for everybody, right, in society. Because if we continue to close the door, if we continue to marginalize people who are trying to self-determine and trying to get ahead, who are self-driven and wanting action at these opportunities, then what kind of society are we really creating? We're creating a society of people living on the fringes. And we know that the number one driver, and I just want to stress this, the number one driver of incarceration is poverty. And the best way to alleviate poverty is through, as Jeffrey mentioned, opportunities to economic mobility, pathways to high-end employment, high-wage employment, and really just giving people a chance. And what Lauren and I talk about often is how can we ask or create the mechanism with employers to create these types of programs like Checkr. Our initial ask is to have every employer that's listening today start with a commitment of we want to have 1% of our workforce to be people that have been justice involved or underserved communities. It doesn't necessarily have to be justice involved, but that would be great if they were justice involved. And we think if you start with that and then work with local community-based organizations, obviously we have a program, shameless plug to use Lauren's, or Checkr has a great bounce back material that they show people how. SHRM has a great program on the human resources site that talks about hiring second chance talent. You have to be proactive. And if you're proactive, this is what I can promise, and Lauren can testify to this, your company will be richer as a result. The texture, the tenor of the culture in your company, and as Jeffrey mentioned so eloquently in his book, companies that lead when it comes to an equitable and inclusive workforce lead in innovation, and they will lead the business of tomorrow. And that's the bottom line.
I think that's a fabulous closing. Thank you all so much for participating in this seminar session, but also thank you so much for the work that you do when you're in your day jobs. I think it makes a huge difference to spread the word that the barriers to fair chance hiring are not actually the people you're trying to hire. That's the untapped talent. I think the barrier is how we think about people, and the barrier is what we want to do with our businesses and the commitments that come therein. So thank you all so much for your amplifying this and shedding a light, but also shedding the solutions, sharing the solutions with all of us. And hope everybody watching today has enjoyed this session. And please reach out if you have questions or want to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much and have a good day.
Thank you very much.